feel free to ask questions or make comments. Okay. Uh, yeah, the ego defenses. Now, the way we've titled these is that we're calling them superpowers, but it's a little untrue because they range over a spectrum from what are literally termed primitive ego defenses up to immature ego defenses, then even higher to, maybe surprising to you, the word neurotic ego defenses. And I'll define that in a minute. And then all the way up to mature ego defenses. So, we're going to make this a quick one today, about 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to try to be efficient. Uh, the mature ego defenses are the highest level ego defenses. And you can use these to your advantage. The reason that we've been terming them superpowers, the mature ones really are superpowers for your behavior, for understanding others, for how to treat others, and how to grow as a person. They are superpowers. The immature and primitive ego defenses are not superpowers. They are Achilles' heels. They're massive disadvantages in your life, in your social life, in your career, in how you feel about yourself, even in your mood and how things go with your life. So let's talk about what is an ego defense. They are largely unconscious when we're talking about the immature ones. They tend to rise in, I'm going to say consciousness, but I don't mean that in a woo-woo, overly overly spiritual way or philosophical way. I mean conscious in that you are quite alert, awake, and aware to their presence and how to do them. The more mature they get, the less mature and even primitive, meaning sub immature, I mean, very, you could say almost animal like or entirely unconscious. The lower you go in the maturity level of these ego defenses, the less aware of them you are. Therefore, the more unconscious they are to you. So there's that kind of stratification of the ego defenses. It's level of awareness or consciousness, or to use the Freudian term you've heard me use before, observing ego. The more observing ego you have, the more conscious, awake, and aware you are to your own behavior, the behavior of others, okay, and the personal growth process. The less observing ego you have, the less, I guess people would call it mindfulness these days. The less mindfulness you have, and therefore the more unconscious you are, and therefore the more purely going on instinct you are. You may have heard of the term acting out, right? We sometimes say children might act out. Well, what exactly does that mean? Acting out uh, has to do with, uh, if you literally think about it, it has to do with unconscious forces driving your behavior. Like nobody's at the steering wheel. You might call it autopilot behavior, purely driven by instincts, running your behavior. Is that in your best interest? Usually no, almost always no, except for one scenario: threat to your life. If you're in a life-threatening situation, your body springs into action. It recoils, it hides, it ducks. It has a startle response. The fight or flight response might occur, and it might save your life. And you need it to operate that way, that unconscious way, purely because the reason of a threat on your life, a dangerous, dangerous situation, might require a split second, well, we call them reflexes, right? So reflexes and instincts are automatic and unconscious. This is also the domain of the immature and primitive ego defenses. If you've ever subscribed to the psychological model called the triune brain model, or if you've been into evolutionary psychology, you might be familiar with the triune brain. And you may have heard of these terms before, the three levels of what they call the triune brain. It's really three different software packages of the mind. The evolutionary psychologists like to think in terms of there being a software running on the brain or various software packages running on the brain. The brain is like hardware, psychology is like software. So evolutionary psychology, toward its beginnings, talked about these various operations that go on, not in the brain itself, but in the mind, in the same way that software isn't the same thing as hardware, but it runs on it. So the more immature we are, the more into the reptilian brain we are. So think of animals, reptiles, and humans. Reptiles are very low creatures in terms of conscious awareness, purposeful decision making. They run completely on instinct, right? They eat and they mate, and they escape danger, and they attack and try to eat something. This is all instinctual. So that's why the word reptilian, for the most instinctual, most unconscious, least mindful, most reflex driven part of the mind, the reptilian brain. I believe that to be the domain of the primitive and immature ego defenses. Now, as we rise up through the triune brain, we get to the mammalian brain where there are emotions, and emotions aren't necessarily in our conscious awareness, but they can be like traffic signals telling us, or a device in your car telling you you're low on oil or you're low on gas. They're like gauges that are giving us information that we could act upon because of various circumstances, some of them dangerous, some of them not so dangerous, but preferable, or things leading to more to happiness or to unhappiness. They're like signals, gauges in your car telling us something about our lives, our surroundings, and how we feel inside. Those are the emotions. That's the mammalian brain of the triune brain model. The highest level, the cerebral cortex area, we would say is the higher brain. And it's where humans surpass other animals, supposedly, except for dolphins, maybe, uh, where we have the most consciousness, the most purposeful decisions, free will, too. You get a tie to the world's religions there, by the way, free will. Decision making can occur, and it's highly conscious and on purpose. Well, this is the domain of the mature ego defenses. So you see us building a kind of stratification or spectrum of level of being awake, aware, and mindful, conscious, and with observing ego, purposeful, having purpose, and simultaneously level of maturity. So less mature we are, the more instinctual we are. Did you ever hear a saying long ago, kids are such animals? Well, what does that mean exactly? It means they're running so much on instinct the younger they are. Less purposeful, less conscious, less self-aware, less self-reflective. So reptilian brained, instinctual, and therefore primitive in ego defenses or immature in ego defenses. What are ego defenses now? Having talked this out a bit, ego defenses are not just unique to one individual. We can't say, oh, well, my ego defense is different from your ego defense if it's the same ego defense we're talking about. So they are universal behaviors, and yet they do change, evolve, and grow if we grow psychologically, which is interesting, in terms of how we conduct ourselves out in the social world. So you might call them universal social behaviors. You might call them universal social instincts, although the higher level ones we become more awake and aware to. And I think what we'll probably do, I'll do this again with Jeremy to specifically cover the topic of fantasy as a more primitive or immature ego defense, and its mature opposite, suppression, as the superpower that we're going to talk about. We'll do that another time, I believe, so that I can have him here too. We'll cover it. And by the way, you ought to see the movie Midnight in Paris by director Woody Allen with Owen Wilson and Rachel McAdams. You ought to see that movie in preparation for when we do the talk about fantasy versus suppression, because it really highlights a lot of interesting nuances to these specific ego defenses that we will cover. Midnight in Paris, see that. So back to our talk. Let's kind of finish this out. What does all this mean? Ego defenses are universal in humans. They parallel and stratify our development. In other words, our maturity process, which is the same as our personal growth, which is also the same as, if you like the idea of spiritual growth, it's the same thing. Maturing, growing mature character. So some of the primitive ego defenses, the most primitive of all, reportedly, is denial. And you've heard of the idea of people being in denial. What does that mean? It means denial of reality. Somebody living in their own world inside. You notice the word denial, it's a little similar to the word fantasy. Somebody that, when we say you're living in a fantasy world, what do we mean by that? Is that pleasant and optimistic and a compliment, or is it derogatory to say you're living in a fantasy world? It's usually derogatory or pejorative. Why would something be derogatory or pejorative? Simply because it's implying immaturity, which is not good in an adult. Being mature is good in an adult, right? So fantasy, as an ego defense, we're going to cover next time with Jeremy, is a little higher level, little more mature version. See, these things come in versions, these ego defenses. It's a little more higher level, slightly more mature version of denial. Denial is complete withdrawal from reality into your own inner world, as a way of comforting yourself. And by the way, another way of what are ego defenses, what do they do? According to Freud and his daughter, Anna Freud, they lower anxiety. So part of why they exist is to lower our level of anxiety by automatically helping us have a pattern built into us. It's like firmware already installed in your computer when it arrives in the mail. It's already in us. It's built into us to get actioned, executed out in the world in certain circumstances that happen. These things automatically happen, especially when we're young and immature, and the primitive and immature defenses just automatically come out. And then we call that acting out a lot of the time. If we expect of, say, a teenager a little more mature behavior than a small child, and then the teenager does something completely unconscious, inattentive, and not self-reflective, we say that teenager acted out. It means the inner instincts and reflexes just ran the behavior, like being on autopilot. So as we're rising up through these, we're going from immature toward mature. And by the way, once we get through being neurotic, which, by the way, Woody Allen is famous for being a neurotic person who went to psychoanalysis for decades, right? And he directed Midnight in Paris. Being neurotic means you're not completely dysfunctional, where you can't have a job or find love or operate out in the world, but you got problems. And the problems aren't to a clinical level where you're diagnosable with a mental illness or you need medicine or even therapy necessarily, but you're not happy completely. Your life, you aren't as successful as you could be. You're not reaching your potential. And it's been said 70% of humans, adults, are neurotic, dominated by neuroticism. So none of us are perfect. None of us are like machines. None of us are superheroes. We all got our problems to figure out. And that's part of what the course of life lets us do, is figure out our little neurotic quirks and try to solve them and get them straightened out. But if we transcend through neuroticism, the third to the top level of ego defenses, we will arrive at the mature ego defenses. Now, what are these? You'll recall these from everything from modern positive psychology and Martin Seligman, who study virtues of behavior, all the way back to the ancient philosophers, Aristotle, Aristotle, Socrates, Epictetus, the Stoics, they were all very concerned with virtue. In other words, what is good? What is goodness? What is being a good human? Which amounted to mature ego defenses or character virtues or character maturity. So ancient Aristotle, Aristotelian ideas, the Nicomachean ethics, really is the same as modern positive psychology. It's concerned with what is our potential as humans, not just disease states, but how could we rise to the most success, the most happiness, our highest potential as people. That's what makes it positive psychology. And they're concerned with these virtues. So virtues you've heard of, like altruism or generosity, charity, tolerance, tolerating other people's ideas, allowing them their ideas without getting offended. That's not very common these days, right? What else? Humor is a virtue. Wit. Suppression, which we're going to learn about next time, is to table something because you can't solve it today, but maybe you can solve it next week or tomorrow. So you table it. You can tolerate the stress or anxiety of a problem not yet solved, but you'll set it aside for now to do things you can solve. Suppression. These are all examples of mature ego defenses, which are the same as human virtues. Courage is another one. Patience is a big one, right? There's numerous human virtues, more than dozens, probably hundreds that you could list that we could cultivate in ourselves to result in good outcomes in our lives. Okay. And I'll end with this. It's a quote from a Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, that is requoted by Freud oftentimes. And it was, character is destiny. What does that mean? It's the secret key to how to use ego defenses or defense mechanisms to go from immature and unconscious, reptilian, instinctual, toward mature, conscious, mindful, and self-reflective. You get good results from that. That's what the quote means. Character is destiny means if you want to steer your life story toward the best possible ending, a happy ending, then you need to cultivate mature ego defenses, which includes the character virtues. The same things covered in positive psychology and in Aristotle, Nicomachean ethics, and in all the world's great religions, when they list the ways to be holy or righteous, to be a good person, in other words. So character is destiny. The only way to get your life on track, in the right direction, toward your highest potential is to work on character virtues, which means mature ego defenses. That's why Jeremy and I are presenting this series of what we're calling ego defense superpowers. The superpowers are the highest level, the virtues, mature ego defenses. Next time, we will cover fantasy as an immature ego defense, similar to denial, and its opposite antidote, the mature ego defense of suppression, the ability to table things that you don't control in favor of things you do. And one of the ways we're going to do that is to examine the Woody Allen film, Midnight in Paris. So please do see that by next time. All right. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to talking to you next time along with Jeremy to talk about the ego defenses of fantasy versus suppression. Thank you.